Okay, I want to welcome everyone that's here with us tonight. I cannot see you, but I see the numbers. So wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in, whatever planetary elevation you're on, welcome. Delighted to have you here. This is a plenary opening of the climate webinar series organized by the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts. I'm a faculty member at IDSVA, as well as the co-conspirator with Professor Glavovic of this climatological series. I also want to acknowledge that Professor George Smith is also here, who provided the seed of inception for this series. This webinar is in fact a second installment of the 3-year-long Climate Change Symposium, and it might go on longer than that. That said, I would like to mention that there will be 2 more webinars, each with 3 participants. Second is in the series is on next Friday, March 22nd. And the third one is on Friday, April 5th, the announcements of which you will receive in the coming days, I believe. Concerning the format of today's gathering, first, Professor Glavovic will give a talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have at least 30 minutes for questions and comments. I would like to ask you to write your question in the Q&A thread, which you can see at the bottom of your Zoom, not the chat thread, but the Q&A box. And I will read the questions out loud, and then we will hear them all. Now, just a few introductory notes on our plenary speaker. Bruce Glavovic has worked as a policy advisor, consultant planner, and academic in New Zealand, South Africa, and the USA. His research centers on how governance shapes societal choices in the Anthropocene. We are delighted to have him here to start this exciting series. And now, Bruce, I give you the screen. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dan. Let me share my screen. And I'll get rid of the floating control. So hopefully everybody is able to see that, and hopefully also you're able to hear me well. So thank you so much for the invitation and opportunity to be part of a series that is very timely and important. And I'm really excited about being part of a lineup of really fantastic thought leaders from a range of different contexts and disciplinary and experiential backgrounds. I'm going to focus on the topic that I've outlined here, which essentially is framing this challenge of climate action as the horns of a dilemma. And I want to explore what it means to enable action, and to do so, it requires a reimagining of the knowledge-action nexus. I'm going to start by sharing with you essentially what is called by Maori people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as a way to give you my background. It's a whakapapa is what it means, and it just gives you context and allows people to understand one's roots. So you'll be able to read the English on the screen. Tēnā koutou, kuia ki mai nei I tēnera, no whereka ki te tonga oku mātua, no koroatia, no ingarangi hoki oku tipuna, I whānau mo o I Timawawi, I tipu aki o I a whereka ki te tonga. No reira, ko Awherika ki te tonga toko whenua tipu, ko Bruce toko ingoa, ko Glavovic te ingoa o toku whānau, I tēnei wā, kei turatia, papioia, aho e noho ana reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā anō tātou katoa. Just to represent this in a visual form, what I have shared with you is that my roots, in terms of ancestral roots, go back to Croatia and the United Kingdom, but I grew up in South Africa. At a time when Black people were oppressed. And so I was part of my life was witnessing the transition to democracy. And that has a powerful influence on any person, especially a white South African. And so the intersection of peace, justice, and sustainability essentially was in my DNA. I did a PhD at the University of Virginia, focusing on environmental dispute resolution to bring together these notions of peace, justice, and sustainability before moving to New Zealand, which you may know from The Lord of the Rings, and have been at Massey University since 2002. And of course, New Zealand is a place that has its own struggle history through colonization, and ultimately the struggle, particularly by Maori people, to realize their opportunities and rights for self-determination. So, as an opening framing and settling of a situation for such a meeting, let me share with you this karakia, which positions us for the conversation. Tuia, tuia, tuia. Tuia tarangi e tu iho nei, tuia te papa e takoto aki nei, tuia te muku tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, tihe moriora. So what I will cover today really is to give you a sense of what I mean by the horns of this climate change dilemma. I'm going to share with you some very synoptic reflections on what we know about climate change, coming at this from the perspective of the IPCC, and in particular the 6th assessment that was delivered about a year ago. Explore the question of how government inaction might be transformed, changed, transmogrified, and how we might reimagine the climate change knowledge action nexus. So what is this horns of the climate change dilemma? It will be no surprise to those of you around this website table that the planet is ablaze. We have runaway warming that imperils prospects for people and the planet. And the horns of the climate change dilemma boil down to the dilemma about how we make progress as a species. Progress is traditionally framed in terms of the way in which business, government, and science has enabled technological, economic, and social advancements. You might describe this as business, politics, and science as usual. And whilst there are many positive outcomes of this endeavor in recent decades, it has set the world alight. And the challenge is, how do we move to a place where there is progress for people and the planet when business as usual is clearly the problem, and that we're going to need to rely on business, government, and science, at least, to be able to transition away from unsustainable, unjust practices towards a different kind of future. So what is the pathway? A pathway that imprisons us in a destructive downward spiral, or a pathway towards an emancipatory upward spiral? And it might sound simple and obvious, but this is the defining challenge of the Anthropocene, a new era that has been defined that represents the human impact that is literally baked into the geophysical reality of the Earth. Oops. So, welcome to the Anthropocene, a defining era that depicts how we have transformed the world around us. One way of representing this is in the planetary boundaries construct that Johann Rockström and others articulated, which has to do with the ecological ceiling that we have burst through our actions, represented in the figure with the red segments of this circle showing how climate change, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, land conversion and biodiversity loss, amongst other defining boundaries, have been breached or transgressed already. Kate Raworth brought to the fore the social foundation that needs to be situated within this biophysical set of limits, and the shortfall that we have in foundational elements of the social foundation, in terms of social equity, political voice, and so on and so forth. So, in short, it tries to encapsulate the imperative to live within the limits of a finite planet, yet provide a socio-economic and political foundation for human progress. Now, the Anthropocene framing has real limits, and there are many who articulate alternative constructs. And I'm not going to dwell on the many different framings, but it's important and even incumbent on us to think beyond the Anthropocene as we engage in this conversation. These are just a couple of examples of different framings that look beyond the Anthropocene and its limits. So what then do we know about climate change? What I'm going to cover here is a quick reflection on some of these points to position further reflection on reimagining climate action. Climate emergency, what emergency? The IPCC was established way back in the late 80s, and its first report came out in the early 90s. And since that time, climate scientists, probably quite accurately reflected in these white elderly gentlemen, making statements about the state of the climate. Fortunately, that has shifted significantly, and we have a much more representative body of scientific experts conveying essentially the same message for over 3 decades. And, really, this is the kind of political and public response. It's despite, 25,000 scientists or something in that order who've been part of this process of over 3 decades of IPCC endeavor. I'd like a second opinion on that body of knowledge. So we have a serious problem. What then are these insights from the IPCC? If you're not familiar with the IPCC, it's not a scientific organization. Essentially, it's a boundary organization that brings scientific knowledge, a synthesis of the available science, to policymakers and to advisors of governments. It's structured in this way with a series of working groups and an administrative architecture. Now, the key thing is those working groups and this architecture was set up in the late 80s. It's now, 2024, and there will be an important question that I want to pose shortly about whether this is still fit for purpose. But this work centered on the physical science, the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability dimension, and the mitigation of climate change, or the greenhouse gas emission imperative. That is essentially what the IPCC is. This figure here shows you it has its roots way back in the late 80s with the World Meteorological Organization and UN Environment Program establishing this body, and then a series of assessment reports, cycles of synthetic assessment that produced a series of reports that are many feet tall by now, the latest of which came out in 2023, and we're at the stage of looking at a global stocktake that will be reported to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So if we just zero in on the IPCC's 6th assessment, there are a series of assessments that came out. There were a series of 3 special reports, one on the oceans and cryosphere, one on climate change and land, and one on the global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And then these were brought together along with the 3 working group reports that I've just indicated and a synthesis report. If you zero in on the middle of that slide, you'll see the message in the bottle that comes out of an astute and really, I think, synthetic observation about the climate change imperative that came out at the time that the Ocean and Cryosphere report was released in 2019. To give you an idea of what this work is, what is involved, if we look at the Working Group 2 report alone, there were 250 authors from 67 countries. We assessed more than 34,000 scientific publications and had to respond and address more than 62,000 review comments. It gives you an indication of the scale, breadth, and depth of the kind of work involved. This is not just a bunch of opinions from a few academics. What are the key findings? I'm not going to go into great detail, which I could easily spend 45 minutes doing, but I want to draw attention to these statements from the Summary for Policymakers, which is, in short, the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health, and any further delay in action will lead to outcomes that are dangerous for humanity, and we'll miss a brief and closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. The choices that need to be made in the next decade. In other words, by 2030, and the choices we make, or the action or the inaction, will dictate medium to long-term pathways. So time is ticking. Without going into more detail about the precise scientific details of these many reports, I think the statements and observations made by Antonio Guterres at recent Conference of Parties summits, where governments come together and decide on action in response to the findings of these reports. He had this to say in Egypt at the 27th Conference of Party World Leaders Summit. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. And these are words not from a radical activist, but from a conservative UN Secretary General. In Dubai, and you won't miss the irony of that, he had this to say: we need to stop kicking the can down the road. Now, these are just 2 sort of headline statements. There's much more that one could say, but it gives you an indication of the nature of the response after 28 Conference of Party meetings in response to observations and concerns raised by the bodies set up by governments to provide advice on the scientific evidence that essentially we have serious anthropogenic global warming and serious consequences for people and the planet. Action is needed now, and these are essentially what these are statements that Antonio Guterres is making at this point in time. There's a real mismatch between science and government action. If we bring this right down to the local level, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the Coromandel Peninsula, a former mayor in this area essentially was a climate change denialist, thumbing her nose over efforts to get local government commitment to take action and to recognize the climate emergency that we are in. Ultimately, her resistance was opposed, and she's no longer mayor. But this is a place that is subject to pronounced extreme events, which is a signature of climate compounded risk, more frequent and intense extreme events. And this region is one of many in this country that is exposed to those impacts. The climate emergency construct is not an unproblematic notion. Many critical commentators and social scientists take issue with the framing of this predicament as an emergency, and they in particular call out the problems of climate emergency politics that tend to lead towards advocating draconian responses that potentially impinge on human rights and so on. And it really questions too whether this is really the most important emergency in the face of many other societal crises. So is climate indeed the most important issue to focus attention on? And are these draconian emergency measures justified? Keep this in mind. We are nonetheless in perilous times. It's not just climate change. We're coming out of an era of COVID that has not gone away. We have navigated a global recession that hasn't quite manifested to the extent that it was anticipated to. And we have a looming tsunami of biodiversity collapse that many are not well aware of. If these were the only waves of adversity that humanity faced, we might sigh some relief. But in practice, there are perilous challenges with respect to poverty, injustice, inequity, oppression, and destructive conflict, not the least of which is in Gaza and the Ukraine, not to mention the Horn of Africa and other global hotspots for geopolitical conflict. So this is a challenging world. I want to shift back to climate change and climate and business as usual, politics as usual, and science as usual. I want to, with humility, just reference a piece of work that I did with two fantastic colleagues, Tim Smith and Ian White, where we raised concern about the course that we are charting by continuing to produce these monumentally important and comprehensive assessments of the state of science through the IPCC process. And essentially, we argue that this is a manifestation of the tragedy of science in general, but climate change science in particular. And we essentially concluded that we need to call for we called for a moratorium on conventional climate change research until governments take real action. And in essence, what we point out here is that there's a real mismatch between the trajectory of global warming and the accumulative knowledge that the scientific community, let alone local communities and indigenous people, have observed as their experience of climate change impacts intensifies. And so despite not only the scientific endeavor with more than 270,000 scientific articles on climate change published in the scientific literature alone since 1970, notwithstanding a range of advocacy interventions and initiatives that include a peak of climate protests around the world and a series of agreements to tackle climate change, indicators are that global warming persists and climate change impacts are intensifying, even accelerating, and we'll reach a threshold of moving beyond 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, literally within a matter of years. This takes us into dangerous climate change territory. The question then is, do we continue business as usual? How might we restore what is a broken science-society contract? This boundary organization, the IPCC, brings scientists together to share knowledge with policymakers responsible to society for charting a course of action that takes us away from a dangerous climate towards an enabling environment. Just one of many of these social dilemmas that I referred to earlier. But clearly, the science-society contract is broken. How do we restore that? What we argued is that we've got three options. We continue climate change science as usual. We deliver more science, get more evidence, and we hope for action. We could intensify the scientific and humanities contribution, or the social science and humanities contribution to the work of the IPCC, and intensify advocacy. But in practice, the extensive work in this space already completed and still underway has yet to change the course of these conference of party meetings and government action as a general rule, and measured simply in terms of the trajectory of global warming and the scale of impact. So hence we draw conclusion that a more radical option is required. The science is settled. We need a moratorium to be able to galvanize action and bring government to a table where more serious interventions are made. There are a range of unresolved questions. For example, do we wait another 6 or 7 years, which is what it takes to produce yet another assessment report? And we're on the cusp of the 7th assessment to be initiated literally in coming months. How might the IPCC help translate its own findings into action, or has it become part of the problem? Is it an anachronism of the late 1980s as scientists gather to reassess what is largely known already, notwithstanding gaps that need to be filled? I would argue that the coming conference of parties, ironically, again in the Middle East, in a climate, in a fossil fuel-driven context, the need to put a line in the sand really needs to be drawn, given the findings of the Working Group 2 report and the synthesis report around the next decade being so important. But what, as a result of this set of challenges, should climate scientists do? What should business and civil society do? What do we do as individuals and as members of society to hold politicians to account? What is the moral imperative that we face as individuals? These are just some of the unresolved questions, or questions that need to be answered, both individually and collectively. What are some alternative perspectives that might inform a way forward? How might climate action meet basic human development needs and freedoms, mindful of the horns of the climate change dilemma that I referred to earlier? How do we enable joined up action that involves all governance actors, not only government and science, but the private sector, civil society, and indigenous people need to have voice around this table? How might we reconfigure the IPCC's 7th assessment that's about to get underway? Unfortunately, it's not only difficult to give effect to a call for a moratorium. The practical reality is that the architecture of the UNFCCC and the IPCC is like a container ship. It is very difficult to turn around. And the structure of the AR7 assessment has been decided. It's going to be done just like every other assessment. In other words, we're locked into a path of science as usual. Who should have made this decision is a legitimate question. Should it have been what is the maladaptive, path-dependent organization? Or does there need to have been opportunity for voice of local people, indigenous people, civil society more broadly? Far be it from me to presume to be able to give answers to how the IPCC should be structured, but some initial thoughts that ought to at least be given attention is that there are priority gaps in knowledge, especially in the global south, that need priority attention. what about the contribution of local knowledges and indigenous knowledges and from the policy practice arena to complement science in providing a true synthesis of the state of knowledge on climate change? How might we move beyond the 5 at best year cycle under the 3 working groups to reconfigure a more effective policy-facing and society-facing series of reports? Perhaps we need an annual priority-focused report that is not subject to government approval and plenary panels that involve lowest common denominator nation-state wrestles, at least together with, if we're locked into a 5-year or 6 or 7-year cycle with the current working group, then we at least need those annual priority focus reports involving other knowledges beyond science. These are really transformational suggestions, and it's not going to happen in the 7th assessment, unfortunately, which means there's very little time to reconfigure the trajectory we're on before the next decade is up. So I'm heading to the last 2 points, and I'm mindful that I'm really squeezing time here. But beyond the role of science and moving beyond science as usual, which in the climate change context is really challenging, it's not dissimilar in other domains of publicly relevant science. But the core challenge is, how do we shift government inaction, in particular political inaction, or politics and government as usual? These are fundamental questions. How do we move beyond politics and government as an enabler of the private accumulation of wealth? You know, the fundamental cabal, the business state, ironclad approach to orienting the political economy for the purpose of accumulating private wealth is foundationally problematic. And we're going to need to find a way to move beyond the apathy and compliance that pervades civil society in this regard. How do we move beyond, in a conference of parties setting, the lowest common denominator outcomes, which are really structured by the prevailing nation-state diplomacy model that applies in these settings, where instead of the conference of parties setting being a place where multiple voices from government, civil society, the private sector, local communities, indigenous people, the more than human, these are arenas of diplomacy. They need to be arenas of struggle and ultimately engagement to be able to move beyond these lowest common denominator outcomes that move in slow, stepwise, incremental fashion when transformational change is necessary. Foundational to this is beginning to unhinge the false dichotomy of the choice between the state and the market as a way to tackle social dilemmas and problems. Neither big government nor the free market is a panacea for the climate change challenge, a problematique that requires engagement of all governance actors, including government, civil society, the private sector, local communities, indigenous people, science, and so on. What then is the role of civil society in climate action? Clearly, at this point in time, the UNFCCC is essentially a conversation between government and science, and that science-society contract is failing with regard to the failure to have the voice of civil society shape the conversation and the direction of these deliberations. So I'll explore this more. And what I want to come to is a suggestion that we need a climate change truth and reconciliation commission embedded in the UNFCCC. This is an alternative model to deal with obdurate social dilemmas manifest in the transition away from apartheid to democracy in South Africa in the early 1990s, where instead of a draconian identify the culprits and hang them, the recognition driven by the peace-oriented, albeit in a violent setting, negotiation-based approach to making the transition to democracy, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was brought to bear, where the voice of the people who had suffered harm through the course of the abhorrent apartheid regime were heard, and the perpetrators of the violence and injustice essentially had to seek forgiveness and essentially be able to bring reconciliation between the perpetrators of this violence and the victims of this violence. A very different model to a Nuremberg-style trial that is more typical. This Truth and Reconciliation Commission suggestion is in the context of an era of post-truth and populism, where the very notion of single truth is, of course, questioned. And it's not to suggest that there's a single truth about climate change, but we need to put the multiple perspectives and experiences on the table to begin to reconcile and chart a pathway into the future. This is manifest in the voice of Nelson Mandela and the struggle that he fought against white domination and a determination to create an environment with voice for all. And I think this kind of thinking would reconfigure our efforts to make sense of the climate change emergency and to begin to chart a course that allows for multiple framings of this imperative, multiple voices and experiences, and begin to find reconciliation of these perspectives to chart a common future. This is the structure of the UNFCCC, and a Climate Change Truth and Reconciliation Commission needs to be central to shaping the trajectory and structure and process and practice of this body, including the IPCC. And again, one could explore all sorts of details around how that might be operationalized, but it's not a fanciful suggestion. Finally, how do we translate this into change on the ground? How might we reimagine the climate knowledge action nexus? And I'm wanting to touch on these 4 points in the remaining slides and the last 5 or so minutes that I'm going to career through what I'm going to share with you. I think the words of Jacinda Ardern that you can read here are quite important. The notion of empathy was one of the central personal political values that she brought to her leadership as Prime Minister in New Zealand. It was a perspective that goes so far beyond politics as usual to be almost amusing to those who lack the capability to understand the power of what she was saying. There is the productive potential of conflict to unlock in this situation. And it's a potential that's been realized in many settings, from the US through South Africa and in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a struggle to secure rights and make a difference. And it's a struggle that is in the streets around the world now on this climate action question. It's not going to work to try and call those responsible to account and literally hang them or make them pay. We're going to have to find an alternative path. And that is why this Truth and Reconciliation suggestion is, I think, a different way forward. But it brings community and conflict right to the fore of this conundrum and this challenge. It is at the community level that climate action unfolds. And of course, there are complicated relationships between individuals, community, and society. And community as a notion is even quaint from the perspective of many. But I want to suggest that with this whole range of perspectives that we're not talking about some romantic ideal that has no bearing in reality, that is ignorant of patriarchy and paternalism and the stultifying nature of insular communities. But it is unlocking the potential of agonism and constructive conflict to reconcile difference and to advance a spirit of community in the face of difference. It goes beyond simple regulatory interactions to engage with radical interventions and protest and struggle to facilitate deliberation and truth emerging through such interactions to chart these kinds of paths. And there is an emerging realization that this needs to be part of the conversation in bridging the knowledge-action gap. Work that I'm privileged to be part of here in New Zealand seeks to explore these issues in on-the-ground interactions, some of which are unfolding literally today, in these 4 communities. They are communities on the front line of climate change. They are experiencing the impacts and transformational change that is underway in these communities. They are coastal communities in places called Putiki and Tangamoana, Waitotra, and Ruhutu. They're predominantly Maori communities, the indigenous people of this land, and it is a real struggle to explore innovative, community-based ways to chart paths that are enabling and even emancipatory. I draw on work I've been able to do with UNESCO's Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission that is structured around the idea of starting with mobilizing your community, not starting by analyzing the technical character of risk, starting with mobilizing your community, building trust to engage in a conversation between local community members, tangata whenua, or the people of the place, the indigenous people of the place, local government, and so forth, to develop shared understanding about the risk that is faced, to rethink futures by developing and negotiating an adaptation plan that charts a course into the distant future, and then to learn from experience and work together to implement such a plan through a negotiated process. This is a contested process. It needs to be mediated and facilitated and community-based. So there's lots to share in terms of some of the things that are emerging in this work, but it demands a reimagination of what community-based action looks like. It means moving beyond false dichotomies. And I'm not going to have time to go into the detail of these, but these range from the people-nature nexus, the place of individuals in communities and society, the false separation of facts and values, of science, local knowledge, and indigenous knowledge and action. The need to move towards emancipatory climate action is compelling, in my view. We need to imagine in new ways the nexus that is knowledge, action, and the range of other dichotomies. Part of this is emancipation from the prison of prevailing ways of thinking and making sense of the world around us, not to mention the entrenched business, politics, and science as usual practices that have brought us to this world that is ablaze. So one could start by looking to indigenous knowledge to reimagine climate action as whakapapa, that is connecting our past, present, and future, and recognizing the indivisible relationship between people and the non-human and spiritual realm. In the context of the Whanganui River, for the people of Whanganui and Putiki, for example, this whakatoki, or saying, I am the river is me, leads to a profound recalibration of what it means to be human and what it means to be in this place. And this was the first river in the world to be granted legal personhood as an indivisible living being. That is transformative change. There is, of course, in the context of the IDSVA's locality, what I think is referenced as thinking about decisions now being oriented towards outcomes for the 7th generation. This is a profound shift in how we reimagine action. It is ultimately about our values, about norms, about ideologies and discourses, but the underlying principles that guide behavior is central. It is about activism. It is about Ubuntu, a Southern African notion where I am because you are. It's about humanity towards others. It's about democratizing democracy in an era of post-truth and populism that is offensive beyond imagining. It is about reimagining climate action as becoming a journey. It's about opening up arenas of engagement. It is about navigating uncharted seas and turbulent seas. It's about deepening everyday spaces for empathy, deliberation, contestation, solidarity, and emancipation. And I think we can look to the transition from apartheid to democracy in South Africa, notwithstanding the deep, obdurate challenges that persist, to informing the way we might navigate these stormy seas and the way that we can find voice for the people and the non-human realm in communities around the world, and especially those most at risk and most vulnerable. So in closing, I would just like to repeat and share with you this karakia that is about stitching these things together. Tuia, 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 tuia te rangi e tu iho nei, tuia te papa e takato aki nei, tuia te mukutangata, ka ronga te pō, ka ronga te ao, ti hei mauri ora. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. You gave us a lot of ideas about the boundaries and phenomenon of boundary. I felt listening to you like as if you were a tightrope walker walking on this boundary, and perhaps the invitation is also to think how to stitch this rope to other realms. We have one question already, or two, and I invite you to write the questions down. I see Carlos Alberto Mayer raised the hand, but Carlos, you will have to write the question. So please, if you can, take a look at the Q&A thread at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Okay, first question, or a series of questions. I'm not sure if you can see these, Bruce, as well, but I will read them so that everyone can hear them. So first one is from Kate Farrington. When you talk about boundary organizations, are you talking about international cooperation across traditional boundaries of nation states, or boundaries among scientific communities and their potentially different frameworks? Can you speak more about the philosophical implications of boundary organizations that boundary organizations can offer in terms of facing climate change together? Or how do you approach the idea of boundaries in philosophical or ethical terms?
Thank you, Kate. I'm using the term boundary organizations in quite a narrow way. There's a literature, unsurprisingly, on this construct, and really the literature that at least I'm familiar with is talking about the role of organizations or individuals that bridge otherwise separate domains. It's often in a science policy context, where bringing understanding from science, for example, the published literature, for example, on climate change, to policymakers how do you facilitate that exchange? These are different worlds on a whole lot of levels. And the IPCC plays a role effectively in bringing that synthesis of scientific knowledge to policymakers for consideration and ideally action. So it's quite a limiting sense. Another practical example would be in the context of a local community. So how do you bring a local community together with local government to chart a path as partners in adapting to the challenge of climate change? Seldom is either the community or government well placed to bridge often broken trust and fractured relationships. It may be that a leader in the community has standing and is trusted by both parties and can facilitate the bringing together of those bodies. It might be a journalist, it might be an academic, it might be an indigenous leader. But boundary organizations is a term that is used at least in that way, but no doubt there are other ways. So recognizing that if we're going to bring local knowledges and indigenous knowledges together with scientific knowledge in the context of the IPCC and that architecture, then we need to find a way to do that. And we're going to need probably a mediated intervention. And that's where a boundary organization might play that role and raises a whole lot of practical and ethical questions. But maybe that's a starting point, Kate. I hope that is a useful starting point.
Excellent. We have a next question from Samantha Jones. Can crowdsourced data collection be incorporated into the next climate change reporting process, thus opening both the knowledge and ownership of the climate problem to action at the local level?
I think, Samantha, that there are many, many ways to open up the space to bring knowledges beyond science to the table to inform decision-making by governments. And ultimately, governance is what we need to be reconfiguring here. In other words, it's not just government that needs to be making these societal choices on behalf of all of us. Is incumbent on us to have the potential for the voice of civil society and government and other actors around that table. And at the moment, the IPCC logic and structure is simply to gather peer-reviewed, published scientific information that is then assessed to convey the extent to which there's confidence in the body of knowledge, because of course there are many entry points to constructing scientific knowledge, let alone other knowledges. And so having a level of confidence about the weight of that knowledge and the agreement around the findings of that knowledge is a large part of what the IPCC assessment process is about. That information is then put on the table for policymakers. At the moment, there's been increasing conversation about bringing local and indigenous knowledges into the process to inform the scientific assessment. But we've not gone very far beyond the original framing. And that's part of what I'm talking about, a transformative change in the way we bring attention to this issue and to inform policymakers. So creating a climate change truth and reconciliation commission would be a means to bring these local knowledges and indigenous knowledges, professional knowledges, and other knowledges and experiences into play with science.
If I can just add a little bit to that, Bruce, additional thought in what you were saying, and that connects to Samantha's question. Is the solution then only possible on the small scale community level, many small community levels, or do you see this transformation as something that can be scaled up, or do we have to go small scale? as a series of small-scale solutions transformations.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think part of what the choice I've made personally is that I'm not going to participate in the next IPCC assessment, and I would urge fellow climate change scientists to make the similar choice. That doesn't mean I'm going off to the incredible natural landscapes to enjoy a life of luxury in New Zealand. On the contrary, for me, working with local communities is where this action is centered. This is the crux of the challenge. And until such time as we make transformative change at the local level and essentially allow that to percolate across society, we won't see the kind of change necessary at in these international platforms. So I see community-based action as the foundation stone for mobilizing civil society and calling for action and holding account the people we elect who make these decisions in places like Dubai or in Azerbaijan, which, you know, where we have these conference of party meetings beholden to the oil and gas industry. It's just a paradox that is hard to ignore.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Here is another series of provocative questions. This is from Maria Patricia Tinajero. Thank you for your presentation and outstanding effort in addressing the impacts of human-induced devastation on the planet. If environmental catastrophes have already set its course, despite the belief that radical changes in policy, science, and thought include giving the proper importance to indigenous knowledges could alter this trajectory given the irreversible collapse of ecosystems. It's a little bit convoluted, but here comes the interesting part. Furthermore, in the event of abrupt changes in business and scientific practices outside capitalism and colonialism, should we maintain a pessimistic outlook regarding the trajectory of irreversible climate change? Should we contemplate embracing the end of humanity as we know it, acknowledging that the human project is not incomplete, but rather insufficient for this task?
Wow. Yeah. You know, of course, I've got the answer to that question. Anybody who thinks they do needs to kind of re-look at their own position in these things. Yeah, I mean, these are fundamental questions. And I think part of what I'm flagging is if we are locked into the dominant framing of this problem and dominant ways of making sense of it that are what has brought us to this precipice in the first place, then yeah, there is no hope. But these are not, you know, sort of the dominant capitalistic ethos and underlying logic of prevailing dominant science, politics, and business is not the only way to engage with the world around us. I mean, we just need to look to indigenous people and to fundamentally alternative framings of what it means to be human and what is our relationship with the world around us, with each other, with the past, the present, and the future. And you get to a very different place. So the hope I have doesn't lie in these forums held in places like Dubai and Azerbaijan, but rather they lie in the difficult conversations in Marae, the meeting houses of local communities, in the halls of small towns in remote New Zealand. That's where change happens. Or under a tree in South Africa, in the struggle for a post-apartheid future.
Thank you, Bruce. This is a shorter question and probably asks for a speculative answer from Hazel Antaramian. How do you imagine artists doing more or contributing toward needed transformation processes? You are still muted, Bruce. You're still muted.
apologies. I was scrolling through the questions that I missed. Could you just repeat that, please?
Absolutely. This is from Hazel Antaramian. How do you imagine artists doing more or contributing toward needed transformation processes?
Yeah. Fantastic question. And, until such time as we move beyond science as the only way of knowing, we are going to be stuck in science as usual. And I'm thrilled to see the rise of the creative voice in the conversations around enabling climate action, the visualization and imagination that is brought by art and artists and designers to this conversation. It can be transformative. I have the privilege in this project that I was describing in these 4 communities of co-leading this with Hannah Smith, a Maori woman who is an academic leader and a person of monumental standing in this context. And she is a significant artist and creative person. And so she brings a new way of having conversations with people and visualizing aspirations, concerns, and new possibilities. So if we don't embed art and design and the creative process in these conversations, we are going to be stuck in path-dependent, maladaptive ways of thinking and being.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And we have another series of questions that relates exactly to the same. I'll just read. This is from Nandita Shet. I'll just read the end because the previous one connect to Hazel's question. How might these interventions, artistic and literary interventions, climate change fiction writing, which is now as well very popular, how might these interventions permeate scientific governmental boundaries? Now, this is also my question too. Just to add to that, in everything that you so clearly said, it seems to me that there is a contradiction in this imagination of values and clear ethics of what is necessary versus the very nature of science, which is incessant explication, incessant drive for progress. So this is why this is a tightrope that you're walking, but we're just trying to imagine how could these ethical imperatives, how might they be translated into governmental boundaries or scientific drive?
Again, it would be arrogant to imagine that I could have a solution for these profoundly important questions. But part of what I'm trying to articulate is the simple notion that this science policy approach to the climate change crisis, which is just a fragment of a much deeper and wider crisis of identity for humanity, for people and the planet, that includes all those other elements that are highlighted. And really, we have to break open this misguided notion that science and policy, or science as usual, politics as usual, and business as usual is a way forward. We need a reconfiguration. And yes, we're going to have nation states with us for at least some time to come. And these interactions and decisions are going to be important in shaping agreements between governments, but we need to prize open that space in forums like Conference of Party meetings so that the voice of civil society, the voice of indigenous people, the voice of local knowledges, indigenous knowledges, of the creatives, of art, of philosophy, of ethics and values is on that table. And the notion of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission allows for those truths, the multiple truths that that configuration of knowledges and experiences brings to the table. As far as I'm aware, in the Working Group 2 report that I was a part of, with 250 other authors, I think there was one philosopher, a trained academic who has a position as a philosopher at a Mexican university, as it happens. Luis, I think, was the only philosopher. I don't think there was a historian. I don't think there was an artist. So we've moved a long way from the late 1980s in the IPCC, where it was dominated by biogeochemists and ecologists and physical scientists, to having many of the social sciences, economics, and so on, many of which psychology, behavioral sciences, which model themselves on outdated notions of physics. But my point is that the space has opened up, but not nearly far enough. And so if we're going to permeate these narrowly confined spaces, we're going to have to engage in struggle to break open what are closed arenas, to open up these arenas for engagement, for authentic voice of these many voices, to begin to have influence and to redirect the trajectory of government decision making. And as long as we're stuck in a logic where it's a diplomacy-based negotiation between nation states, where the voice of Saudi Arabia and Russia is equivalent to the voice of a small island developing state and the US, that idea that you could be held hostage by nations that are dependent on fossil fuels or whose agenda is far from advancing the needs of people on the planet, we are not going to see any change. We need to hold our elected members to account. And as a society, we have to find ways to confront authoritarianism and so on. And countries that yeah. So, I mean, these are deep questions. In the climate change space, I think we can prize open the UNFCCC, but it's going to require transformational change. And the Climate Change Truth and Reconciliation Commission is one intervention that I think could help permeate those boundaries.
Absolutely. Thank you. You have addressed to a certain extent this question too, but I just want to affirm it because it speaks to something that is actually happening. Not a lot, but certainly it's happening. This is from Lisa Williamson. There are several opportunities today that invite artists to work alongside scientists in order to poeticize and amplify scientific data in order to reach an apprehensive audience. Do you see a promise in these collaborations? This is absolutely true. There's a whole series of artists working closely with physicists and chemists and so on, and to produce collaborative work.
Great question, Lisa. A business as usual approach to this would be that the scientist would tell the artist, the creative, what messages they want to convey, assuming that they know the target audience, and we would have a unidirectional translation of that science through art or poetry, and presumably that would lead to some rational outcome where the intended target audience would change a policy or change behavior. That is a flawed logic that won't work. What is needed and where there's potential and promise is where creative people are part of a conversation in community, where the voice and concerns of local people and indigenous people, members of a community, people in local government dedicated to making a difference, can express concern and aspiration. And it's the artist, it is the poet who can hear and in an elicitive way share an articulation of those voices along with science. So, and I'm wanting to downplay the authoritarian privileged position that science seems to hold for itself and recreate and democratize the science policy interface. And the creative person, the poet, the philosopher has an incredibly important and powerful role in helping to democratize that kind of decision making. That's where the promise lies. The potential lies at the local level, engaging with a limited number of people where this is possible. I would love to see this ricochet right up through to the UNFCCC Conference of Party context. It might take a little while to get there.
Thank you. Excellent answer. I think for us, certainly here, to poeticize is to amplify. Poeticizing is amplification of existence itself, of life itself. So certainly this is something that we would like to see injected into the scientific discourse as well. Another question from Maria Patricia, and this relates to this curious example that you mentioned at the end of your presentation, which is that in New Zealand, there's a river that attained the status of a person, I believe you said. And this is the first one on the planet, which is really incredible. Obviously, for many indigenous communities, rivers and animal and plant entities are persons, but to actually be recognized officially is really incredible. So if you can touch on that. But the question is a little bit broader. How do you perceive the role of non-human entities such as soil, water, and plants in confronting climate change? What can we learn from them?
Yeah, this is really, really important, perhaps more important than I and many of us begin to fully understand. This is about the recalibration of the people-nature nexus. And it is indigenous peoples in particular who bring a fundamentally different way of constructing this nexus and these relationships. And the institutionalization of this legislation in 2017 in the Te Awa Tupua Act is a product of a struggle over generations by the people of this land to have voice, to have their cultural values, practices, and positions recognized and articulated, and for the foundational the founding document of this country, the Treaty of Waitangi, to be delivered properly. This reconfiguration of what it means to be a person and our relationship with the world around us is foundational. There's much to be learned, and there are lots of practical challenges. I mean, the voice of the river is articulated through guardians who speak on behalf of the river. And so Maori can do that in ways that I can't do it. I can't speak on behalf of the river. I can't speak on behalf of the non-human realm, but I can connect in ways that are significant for me, that are metaphysical, that are spiritual. And they're foundational to confronting the interconnected crises that I've been talking about. So yes, there is opportunity to translate the intrinsic value and even rights of nature into regulatory architecture. And I would argue that this is fundamentally important if we're going to change the course of the way we make decisions in the formal institutions of society. But it is a struggle, and it took resistance, it took protest, it took civil disobedience to get to the place where these changes could be brought into play. And the kind of positive relationship in the context of Putiki again, the real community-led adaptation work that has been led by leaders in that community as equals around a table with representatives of local government, is the product of an intergenerational struggle that they have had this torch pass from one to the other, and they're now in a place where it's a different kind of interaction. It's no longer only civil disobedience and protest that is necessary and possible to make a change. They now have the act behind them to inform, and in fact, this act and the principles that underpin this are now guiding, and in fact are written into agreements that we have facilitated between local government and the community of Putiki, with national government departments, written into a memorandum of understanding about working together to adapt. And we are negotiating a framework agreement around how to adapt, with those principles being the foundation stones for that trusting relationship necessary for building enduring capacity and resilience that is community-led. So that involves the voice of the river, of the non-human realm in that agreement. That is embedded in the principles that are there. So absolutely, there's a very practical operational process that one can go from a legislative regime through to locally based, community-led plans to make a difference in partnership with others.
Excellent, thank you. I'll move on to Natalie Velez question, comment. Thank you, Bruce. Great conversation. I have a question related to art and environmental groups. Do you think their actions, food counterattack and message, what is more important, art or the right to healthy and sustainable food, is justifiable? If not, what is a better way? Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I feel awkward in that, you know, a real dialogue would involve a conversation, and this forum doesn't, you know, essentially it's quite a static interaction. So I feel somewhat frustrated and wish I could be around sitting in a circle and having a real conversation where it's a to and fro. But I think your question requires that kind of exchange. It's really important. I don't think I think the way you framed the question leads to a yes, no, either or response. And I don't think that does justice to what you're asking. I think it's a far more complex and rich conversation. And as one simplistic line of thought that is going through my mind, you know, as just a very superficial perhaps response comes back to the notion of basic human needs. And if we take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is, you know, nearly 100 years old, he framed basic human needs in terms of these biophysical and then security, a sort of a layering of needs, and that we need to meet those food, water, reproduction, etc. needs before we move up the chain to satisfy higher order needs. And of course, you know, work by people like Bronfenbrenner and others who've taken a more ecological approach to human needs that situate the individual within, you know, layers of interaction, community, society, the world around us, etc. I think this, yeah, the reason I say this is because people are willing to take a stand to pursue ends that matter to them. Whether it's going on a hunger strike to realize basic human rights, whether it's conscientious objection against resistance to being part of a violent response and to take up arms to fight perhaps an unjust war, you know, these are responses that we put those higher order needs second to those basic food, water, shelter type needs. And so I think that the foundation for the conversation we're having now is an ethical and moral position that says we need to look beyond the current preoccupation with private interest, short-term gain, materialistic and consumerist interests, to think about not only our individual layering and range of needs, but our needs with respect to the individual and community and the world around us. And so the better way is about opening up spaces for those conversations where people can articulate those hopes and concerns about breaking through the path dependency that is represented by the dominant framings of business, politics, and science. And I think that art and philosophy and poetry and so on, and the advocacy that comes from groups, whether it's Extinction Rebellion or others, plays a role in reconfiguring and essentially just challenging conventional wisdom and ways of being.
Thank you. There's another short contextual kind of question. I think you also answered it to a certain degree. This is from Ellen Jones, just a little bit more up if you scroll. Do you have thoughts on how to navigate tightrope repair in the USA, where we are awash in post-truth and populist dogma? So I just thought this is relevant too, because it is the context we are battling in. It's not just science attitude or science in action, but also this context of post-truth and populism, rising populism.
Great question, and it's not limited to the US. You have seen the election of right-wing governments from New Zealand to Sweden, and everywhere in between that are very, very problematic in terms of these issues that we're talking about. And if we were to blame politicians, we'd miss, I think, a fundamental point from the get-go, which is the role of civil society in recalibrating politics, the new politics as usual, exemplified by Trump and all that comes with that in this era of post-truth and populism. On a personal note, I lived in the US for 6 years. My children were born there. I have a sister in Florida and a brother in San Francisco. They've been there for decades. And so I have a point of entry, but I wouldn't presume to have an answer about navigating this tightrope, other than to say that it is necessary for civil society to stand up. It's necessary for individuals to stand up. And there is a proud and long history of social movements and a resistance to denigrating and violent suppression of people in the US. And as much as we might like to think that we've moved beyond those various problems, whether it's institutionalized racism or gender inequality, the reality is that you have a terrifying prospect if let's be candid, if Trump is elected, not just in the US, but around the world. So how do you stop that? I mean, the answer is really simple. You've got to, civil society has to stop that. Citizens have to stop that. And, operationalizing that is another matter. But I think for me, a Climate Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the US would be one small contribution to shifting that conversation. So maybe that's, a modest suggestion that perhaps in the midst of everything else, we need to open up an arena for a different conversation on the climate question, especially in the face of the risk of intensifying populism and post-truth politics in the US.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bruce. Excellent answer. This problem that we're facing here with the elections, of course, reminds me of what Samuel Kochanski asked. This is a purely philosophical question, nearly impossible to answer because it's impossible to diagnose, which is what makes the individual vote against their own interests. This seems to be the case that's happening everywhere throughout history, in so many different places, including here. So this is, to me, why philosophy is so important, because only philosophy can diagnose this strange predicament.
Yeah, another brilliant question. I just finished, this is a ridiculous admission, I finished writing a chapter for a book at 3:45 this morning that was overdue with the publisher. And in the last paragraphs of the conclusion, it struck me that the notion of collective self-harm is an apt description for where we are on this climate crisis, climate action question. And you know, the cumulative outcome of these individual choices is collective self-harm. And so and there are multiple points of entry. Yes, philosophers have critical insights on this question. Behavioral scientists presume to be able to nudge and frame solutions in ways that seem to have particular appeal to policymakers, but completely ignore some structural drivers of why people are locked into pathways that are collectively self-destructive. And so we need not only the behavioral scientists with the limited understanding that they bring to this issue, but the creatives, the philosophers, and the others, because, you know, the behavioral scientists, the economists, and psychologists will, you know, talk about the prisoner's dilemma, and they'll talk about the tragedy of the commons and the various, you know, ways of framing why it is that we don't make good collective choices, and you know, have answers from economics, from psychology, etc. But I think, Dan, you've really put your finger on it. These are fundamentally philosophical, and I would argue ethical questions. And I think, you know, that is where we need to go. This is a values-based conversation, which, coming from a scientist, is an odd position, because science lauds itself on being objective and independent, and that is, to use a technical term, bullshit. So, yeah, great question. And the challenge is, at the community level, the visible connection between people and place is manifest. When you're sitting in a boardroom in Dubai as a representative government, you are disconnected from reality. And so how can you begin to vote for the fundamental interests of humanity and the planet?
Yes, I think you used multiple times excellent term, recalibration, that's necessary in order to adjust this gap between science and ethics. I think it's an excellent term. Professor Simonetta Moro, our own director of studies here at IDSVA, also has a comment or an interjection. There she is. Welcome, Simonetta.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you so much, Bruce, for this wonderful talk. Very inspiring, I must say. And thank you, Diane, for organizing this symposium. I have the distinct privilege to be on this panel, so I can't type my question in. But really, first, I had an observation. You know, when you were answering those questions about artistic interventions, how artists can contribute, and I was reminded of that famous action that Joseph Beuys did a few decades ago, planting 7,000 oaks in the city of Kassel over 5 years. And then that action was taken back, I think, in New York City by the Dia Foundation. So there are some trees that sort of belong to that legacy of Beuys. And you know, that to me speaks about something concrete that can be done. And I personally know of a small group of, I hesitate to call them activists because they're really regular people from the small town where I come from in Italy. And this is a group that organized around one single goal, which is to protect, preserve, and plant new trees. So all they do is really to advocate for trees. And it strikes me as something that might seem very small, but even without presenting themselves as, you know, being concerned about climate change, which of course they are, but their mission is really to, you know, to plant more trees and to keep the ones that are there. It makes me wonder if there may be multiple ways of thinking creatively. You know, how can we, in our individual small existence, can somehow make a difference? And then I'm dreaming of a sort of network where all around the world these small organizations can be linked and find ways to speak with each other. I don't know if something like that exists. Maybe you can say more about that.
I think that is one of the things that is exciting about the action being mobilized in all corners of the world on a range of issues that in and of themselves individually may not seem to amount to much in terms of global impact, but like 1,000 lights, each ultimately contributes to something that becomes visible and impactful. And whether it is networks of cities sharing, learning, and working, communicating and connecting to make a difference, which is a very real, long-standing reality, or whether it is people that are planting trees or sharing locally grown food or whatever. I mean, this is my point about the local matters. I guess it's almost, whilst you may not want to describe these individuals as activists, they are active in their community. And I think part of the hegemony of the way we live is that people are disconnected from those around them, the people around them, let alone the world. And so, you know, as much as the notion of community is quaint and criticized from many quarters, I think it's a powerful and important construct because it says something about people as more than individuals. And I think that means that there are ways to work together on many fronts that ultimately are about collective action. And so this notion of collective action as a foundation for confronting social dilemmas is at the heart of everything that I've been talking about and reflecting on, not in a comprehensive, rational, or that kind of stuff. I'm talking it fundamentally from a political and power perspective. We need to mobilize active citizens to make a difference that reconfigures the way we think and act. And I think that example of planting trees, these are practical steps that we can do in between taking kids to school and making lunches and feeding the dog. You know, we live ordinary lives and we need to be extraordinary in the actions we take.
Thank you, Bruce. That was wonderful.
And perhaps a last question we have really bombarded here, Bruce, and without being able to really see you. So this is a second question from Nandita, and it connects to this everyday life that you were mentioning, Bruce. Can we perhaps connect to ideologies drastically different from ours through the non-human connections we all have? I'm thinking for example, of common interests of conservationists and hunters in some areas of the US, or another example on a minor scale, dog lovers in the neighborhood talking across political lines. I think it's a wonderful thought, because in the everyday life, this kind of boundaries do cross.
Yes, Nadita, fantastic observation and question. And again, we could spend another 2 hours exploring this. I grew up in Southern Africa, and the forced removal of people to make way for protected areas is deeply problematic and offensive on a whole lot of levels, but also has meant that species like rhino and other megafauna, not to mention regular wildlife, persists, albeit under an onslaught of attack. So real conundrums, but again, I look to indigenous people and local people to find hope in these interactions. They are real dilemmas in many cases to reconcile those interests, and whether it is walking a dog, or whether the privilege of being able to walk a dog is well beyond you because the struggle to feed your family and have shelter persists, you have connection to the world around you. And I think that depending on where you are, that connection and that physical and spiritual connection is fundamentally important. The whole notion of hunting has a whole lot of ambiguity and paradox and contradiction inherent in it. And there isn't time to explore that now. But again, I think we need to create arenas for engagement and deliberation that allow for difference and perspectives that are contrary to our own to be put on the table, and to navigate a way to craft collective solutions for these common problems that mean that ultimately the development trajectory in a place like Paraguay is different and yet locally relevant to that social ecological reality, to the pathway chosen in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Mozambique, in the United States, or in Fiji. And that, for me, is where this goes to at the end of the day. It's about reconnecting with each other and reconnecting with the world around us on physical and metaphysical levels. And that's a challenge for a lifetime.
Excellent. Many thanks for this answer and for all the other answers, Bruce. I just want to echo what Professor Glavovic has said to Natalia's, in answering Natalia's question. Most of these, of course, would require us being at the same table and speaking. Trust us, trust me, we have tried our best to answer and to address all of your questions without really seeing you. It is an odd thing. We're not fully robotic yet, so it's an obstacle, I have to say. But thank you, Bruce, for so elegantly and passionately answering everyone. I think we missed only a few, but trust me, we saw your comments, and I think the answers also encompassed your comments as well. And I thank all of you for being here. We're truly all over the planet right now, and looking forward for you to join in the next coming weeks. I want to thank Professor Morrow as well, and Molly Davis for helping shape things up and sharpening the webinar as well.
Thank you, Diane. And I wonder if George is there and he may want to say a few words.
Or thank you,
Professor Smith. Hello.
Yes, thanks, George. And thank you, Dan. What a beautiful evening you put together for us. Bruce, I have many things to say to you and many things to ask of you. for now, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And to mention to the audience that in April, we'll be awarding Bruce an IDSVA honorary doctorate. And I will say that that will be a proud day for IDSVA. We are just absolutely honored by your presence and by your contribution that you've made not just tonight, but to the world. So thanks again.
Thank you, George.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
I think we will stop here. Thank you so much again.
Mauri ora.
Cheers. Bravo. Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. I look forward to the next sessions. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a good day, good evening, everyone. Good morning, and until soon.
Yes, of course. Soon,
Bye,
Bruce.
everybody.
You all stay well.
Bye.